It had long been supposed, both in fan circles and among Star Trek writers, that the Enterprise-B, third ship to bear the name, if we ignore the NX-01, would be an Excelsior-class starship. And so it came to pass that in 1994, Star Trek Generations introduced us to the Enterprise-B, and indeed, she was of the Excelsior-class, except she was an Excelsior of a type we had never seen before, and were destined to never see much of again. Welcome to the mystery of the Enterprise-B. In a previous video, we pondered over the question of where the Enterprise-A came from. In this video, you might say we are pondering over where the Enterprise-B went. We can easily surmise that the Enterprise-B was decommissioned at some point prior to 2344, the year in which the Enterprise-C was destroyed, and unless the latter ship was on her maiden voyage, which would have been mentioned in dialogue in yesterday's Enterprise as it would have been noteworthy, then the decommissioning of the Enterprise-B would have been significantly earlier than 2344, perhaps as much as a decade. I, for one, would like to think the Enterprise-B served Starfleet faithfully and was eventually decommissioned. If it had been destroyed, then getting personnel for any starship called Enterprise would have been quite the challenge. Let's face it, any ship in Star Trek with that name is going to be a dangerous place. There is a fan theory that suggests the Enterprise-B did survive, and in a surprising manner, but we shall come to that shortly. Launched on stardate 9715, otherwise known as 2293, the Enterprise-B was a modified Excelsior, and we might call it the Enterprise-B subclass. Additions to the Excelsior design were made to the front end of the engineering hull around the navigational deflector, giving it a flared look, very disco, very staying alive. Twin structures were added to port and starboard of the already massive impulse engine complex. Extra details were added to the nacelles. A repaint lighted the model. And, according to the website X*Scientia, the upper portion of the primary hull was replaced. The real-world reason behind this transformation of the 7.5-foot Excelsior model was the need to have very evident damage after a ribbon of energy strikes the Enterprise-B in the film. By adding the flared shapes, the effects people could damage the model without actually damaging the original Excelsior model underneath. This, though, left the Star Trek universe with a slight problem. In a franchise liberally seasoned with Excelsiors of the original configuration, the Enterprise-B was the only ship, bar one, of this somewhat unique appearance, and so the legacy of this design is virtually non-existent. In universe, the Excelsior-class seems to have become the workhorse of Starfleet. The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and even Voyager all had examples of Excelsiors in use as late as the 2380s, a century after the Great Experiment was launched. Some of them had hull registries high enough to suppose they were contemporaries of, or built later than, the more modern Ambassadors. For example, the Ambassador-class USS Adelphi, NCC 26849, and the Excelsior-class USS Albertani, NCC 42995, the Ambassador-class USS Excalibur, NCC 26517, and the Excelsior-class USS Cairo, NCC 42136. It should be noted that, although there was a drift in Star Trek towards higher hull registries for newer starships, in general these registries were not, and are not, an infallible guide to the youth or maturity of a starship. Think of the NCC 1017 of the Constellation in the original series. But if we take the hull registries at face value, then we can speculate that the Excelsior-class starships were built in batches, possibly 4 batches, as there seems to be a numerical clustering of hull registries. These batches were not built all at once, but over several decades. as I said earlier, the only ship bar one. That one other modified Excelsior was the Lakota, as seen in the Deep Space Nine episode Paradise Lost, which was first broadcast in 1996, 2 years after Generations hit cinema screens. The Lakota had NCC 42768 as her hull registry, so we can suppose that she was a Batch 3, or at least built during the late period of the Excelsior-class expansion, alongside the Hood, the Grissom and the Al-Patani. In this desert of late Excelsior clones, the Lakota was the lone modified Excelsior. Why on Earth, or off Earth, would the shipyards and Starfleet suddenly choose to build a second modified Excelsior based on a design used only once decades ago for the Enterprise-B? There is a fan theory expressed by a correspondent to Ex Astris Scientia. This theory suggests that there was only ever one modified Excelsior-class starship, and that was the Enterprise-B. At some point, so the theory goes, a new Ambassador-class Enterprise was announced, but instead of decommissioning and scrapping the existing Excelsior-class ship, Starfleet renamed the Enterprise-B, making it the Lakota, complete with a new and contemporary hull registry. It is an interesting theory that I personally rather like, and it should be noted that such an act has precedence. In the late 1930s, the 1824 British frigate Unicorn had to be renamed so that a new aircraft carrier could use the name. After the latter was scrapped in 1959, the name was returned to the Dundee-based frigate. However, an argument against this theory would be that no one in the DS9 episode mentions the Enterprise-B, not even to make a quip. Had the Lakota been the Enterprise-B once upon a time, it would have been a noteworthy subject. Of course, in a very real sense, the Lakota was indeed the Enterprise-B, just as the Enterprise-B was indeed the Excelsior. The Lakota was the same filming model, renamed but not reconfigured back into the original Excelsior-class look. So what happened to the Enterprise-B? Was she decommissioned to make way for the Enterprise-C? Or was she renamed Lakota? Well, the Enterprise-B would have been at least 40 years old by the time the Ambassador-class Enterprise was announced, although age does not seem to have condemned the original Excelsior design itself. But given the few ships of what we are here calling Batch 1, seen in The Next Generation et al., we can suppose that the majority of these earlier Excelsiors were indeed decommissioned and scrapped prior to 2344, including the Enterprise-B. But what about the modified Excelsior design? If the Lakota was not the Enterprise-B, then why was she built using an old modified design that had been apparently discarded? The answers to these questions do not lie inside the fiction of the Star Trek universe, but outside of it. In the real world, the larger Excelsior model was modified for Star Trek Generations as the Enterprise-B, and then reused as the Lakota 2 years later without the costly and difficult work of returning it to the original Excelsior design. But it is fun to exercise our critical thinking skills on such a subject. In the DS9 episode, there is a mention of a refitting or modification of the Lakota, and so in universe, it was a coincidence that those modifications made the starship look just like the long-scrapped Enterprise-B, as unlikely as that might be.